I want to ask you what inspired you.
Yeah, so we're talking about 20 years or so ago, even more. It was in the late 90s, well, even in the mid 90s, I did a stint as a counselor. And
Right.
then later in the 90s, I sat on council for a few years with former Chief Frank Muse. And in the late 1990s, of course, that's when the Donald Marshall Jr. court case came down, upholding a 1760-61 treaty right to fish. And I don't think a lot of people realized what a turmoil of a time that was. Our whole communities were in turmoil. So we celebrated that day. Then, of course, we know what had happened in Burnt Church and other areas, and the same has happened here, and history repeated itself here just a couple of years ago. And so I think we were all pretty well burnt out. And my community was one of those communities who wouldn't sign the fishing agreements. And we never signed a food fishery agreement or a commercial fishery agreement. We just felt somehow in our hearts that that was watering down our treaty rights, or there just wasn't that confidence. So to make a long story short, it was amid this that I let my name stand. I think the former chief, though he ran, he was pretty well burnt out. In retrospect, we just kind of tried to help each other that time, and I did that. It's in that context that I ran for chief. And of course, I had a couple of really great mentors. My own grandmother, who was chief in the mid 70s, and she sat on council. My grandmother's name was Chief Leona Pictou. She was a Jeremy, and of course Chief Rita Smith of Glooscap in the early 80s. Then, of course, in the last couple of years, I discovered that we had even an earlier chief. I knew about Chief Rachel Marshall in the late 60s till I think about 1971. And then, unbeknownst to many of us, there was Chief Mary Puro in Wattmacook. She was one of the first female chiefs in Nova Scotia, anyways, of 1962 to 64. Now, I just want to talk a bit about that, why this is so courageous. And I know there's a lot of talk about the Indian Act chiefs, and I myself have been critical of that system. And when we say the Indian Act chiefs, this is the only colonial way that we were allowed to vote for leadership in our communities, and it of course displaced our hereditary systems. And we do. I know the Grand Council is working on their traditional governance system, and we as women are trying to inform a lot of these processes. But I just want to go back to how brave it must have been for this Mary Puro. Indigenous women across Canada couldn't even vote in their own chief and council elections till 1951. We couldn't run for chief and councils until 1951. We didn't receive the right to vote even in federal elections till 1960. Now, go back to 62. That is incredibly courageous. It was like 10 years after we just received the right to vote or run, and just 1 year after we received the right to vote in federal elections. And after decades of a very patriarchal colonial system, these women like Mary Puro, and there's many others in New Brunswick and so forth, Rachel Marshall, my grandmother, Rita Smith, they were the forerunners. So I've been doing a lot of reflection on that. And I think it's those women who I stand on their shoulders that gave me the courage at that time to run for chief. And it wasn't easy because we didn't only have the patriarchal system in our system. I was dealing with a lot of non-Mi'kmaq fishermen. And I do remember distinctly walking into a room, and I had my counselor, Rob McEwen, who's a grandson of the late Richard McEwen, who was chief for many years. And I asked the fishermen where the women were, and they told me they were home where they should be. So that was the context. And so that's how I started, and it was really, when we say Indian Act, that's the programs and services that we provide through the federal government, provincial governments, if you will. But really, there's a lot more that a chief undertakes in terms of trying to advocate for our treaty rights, our Aboriginal rights, and so forth. And that was the mode that I was in, although I found it very difficult at the time because sometimes you felt like a federal employee, but at the same token here, we were trying to assert our treaty rights. Community was at a juncture, of course, and of course we were in the midst of a lot of pressure. But just to even go back a few years before that, when I first came on council, we were struggling then with Department of Fisheries and Oceans with the food fishery agreements. They were being imposed upon us. And back in those days, like we're looking about 1997, just a couple of years before Marshall, where DFO officers would come into the band office and drop off tags and refuse to leave. So this was the type of environment, and then we win this commercial right, but we wouldn't sign these commercial fishery agreements and so forth. And so I was a little bit worried. Frank had did a lot of legwork during those times. He fought hard to protect our treaty rights. He didn't agree with the food fishery agreements, and of course we weren't going to agree with the commercial fishery agreements. In hindsight, yeah, I think we were trying to help each other out, but politics it was so critical at the time. It was a confusing, chaotic time for the community. Which way do we go? You have all this pressure to sign those agreements, and we just had to find other avenues, and what we chose to do, I would say, even in Frank's time and my time, and we try to continue to do, I would say, even with our current chief and council, Chief Carroll, and the council, is what are the Mi'kmaq concepts? How would they implement this? Even though it's a commercial right, how would we implement this from a Mi'kmaq perspective? And unfortunately, at that time, there was no room for alternative visions. It was either you assimilate into the commercial fishery as it was, or that was it. Initially, it was Bear River First Nation, Bucknakeg, formerly known as Afton, and Suspenagony. Chief Reg Maloney, he didn't really agree with those agreements. And when the council ultimately decided to go into the commercial fishery, he said, well, if you're going to do this, at least have a lawyer there. So for the longest time, there was 3 communities, and then eventually Suspenagony signed on, and then there was the 2 remaining communities. We're commercial fishing, but we're trying to figure out a way to do it that it sustains livelihoods. We still have to assert, and the community or the chief and council get a hold of me every so often, that, listen, you can impose what you want upon us, but we want it on record that we do not. This is, this is not an agreement with your system. We're doing what we have to do to provide a livelihood, to provide our food, but this does not mean that we agree with the federal system.
Yeah.
I had people ask me, to run. It was a chaotic time, and ironically, though, it's a very patriarchal system. But in my own community, I didn't feel that.
Yeah.
Isn't that a strange thing? I felt really encouraged by the young men in my community, and I still do. I feel that they want my advice, they respect my advice, and so forth. It's only until you have to engage with those other departments, federal departments, or in those larger contexts of where there's a majority of male chiefs that you start to really feel the misogyny, if you will. We didn't call it that at the time, but now that I reflect on some of the statements that were made, or being I and a few other women chiefs, we'd be shut down very quickly, or we would be the last to speak, and so forth. Thank heavens for elders, because I did have, I know with the Atlantic Policy Congress of Chiefs, we had Margaret Lubelwa as an elder, who was a former chief. There was a Tremblay, an elder, and I remember I would sit by them, and they guided me so wonderfully. I sat by them because I was so angry at a lot of stuff at those days, with particularly the way meetings were conducted and when federal ministers would come in and so forth, and try to say, okay, well, I'm going to sit so these elders will ground me. Well, those two would say, Sherry, you got to get up and you got to say this, particularly when it came to health issues. You gotta get up. So they were warriors more so than I was in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't know what the actual moment was.
Okay.
And of course you do these things, and I don't think I half expected to win. And when I did, I was so shocked. And I remember my cousin telling me, he said, well, you better pull up your socks and get to work. Stop worrying about how or what. And so yeah. So that's how I've got into that. I was fortunate to have Dawn McEwen, who is the granddaughter of Richard McEwen, and Steve Muse. And whereas before, even as a council member, we had such a small council, I was the only female all the time. You know what I'm saying? So it was kind of interesting being chief and having Dawn by my side as that. And then there was a full chief and council, female chief and council that came after. I even was threatened with third-party management. And for those folks who don't know what third-party management is, you have to fall into a deficit, and if you fall into a deficit with your expenses and running the community, the feds will come in and basically take over. Well, I wasn't in deficit, as I refused to implement some of their policies that I thought was inequitable. Yes, there was a big difference. The way that I operated, I would like to think, and maybe sometimes I wish I was a little bit more disciplined, but having worked for the council for a number of years, I was trying to motivate people to take their programs and develop solutions from the ground up. It didn't have to come from the chief and council, to give them a little bit more freedom with their budgets, how they did things. And that's a big move. And in hindsight, perhaps we should have did a little bit of capacity building, because all of a sudden they didn't have to run to the chief and council. Like, I was the type of chief, if it was covered in your policy, don't bug us. We have bigger fish to fry. You know, that was and so I think there was a difference that way. We did have a cultural center up and running for a bit. And well, I'm thinking as counselor too now, even prior to becoming chief, we worked very hard to get the health center up and running. And also, but as chief, we did this commercial right, but we wouldn't sign these commercial fishery agreements and so forth. And so I was a little bit worried. Frank had did a lot of legwork during those times. He fought hard to protect our treaty rights. He didn't agree with the food fishery agreements. And of course, we weren't going to agree with the commercial fishery agreements. But you're absolutely right. In hindsight, yeah, I think we were trying to help each other out, but politics it was so critical at the time. It was a confusing, chaotic time for the community. Which way do we go? You have all this pressure to sign those agreements, and we just had to find other avenues. And what we chose to do, I would say, even in Frank's time and my time, and we try to continue to do, I would say, even with our current chief and council, Chief Carroll, and the council, is what are the Mi'kmaq concepts? How would they implement this? Even though it's a commercial right, how would we implement this from a Mi'kmaq perspective? And unfortunately, at that time, and there was no room for alternative visions. It was either you assimilate into the commercial fishery as it was, or that was it. Station of the fisheries is so much now that there's very few independent fleets left. And I wish that we had went a little bit further, because the fundamental difference for us, and I remember Chief Debbie Robinson, who was chief when I'd come on, and I think Chief Andrea Paul and I became chief at the same time, and of course Chief Andrea Paul is still there, and now we have Chief Annie as well, who's such a wonderful advocate for Indigenous women's rights. But I remember Chief Debbie Robinson trying to tell folks, we have to live here. Our kids go to school with non-natives. Our kids go to school with non-Indigenous folks, or some of these fishermen's children. And so we had to find that peaceful resolution. And it was quite, so we started a lot of the legwork on that.
I don't know, it's hard for me not to call it battles, but in the height of the fishing disputes, you and Deborah were part of talking with the local fishermen.
Yes, and I must attribute some thanks here to former Chief Frank Muse as well, who had kind of started that process. Because I remember I was still counselor and Chief Frank wasn't available, and a huge fisherman, came into the community. And when I figured out he was a fisherman and wanted to tour the community, I'm thinking, oh, I was like shaking in my boots. This was before all this other lovely work had taken place. And it was the first time he set foot on a reserve, and he was there by the invitation of former Chief Frank. So there was a lot of cross-cultural work that was done in those days. There was a lot, we didn't always agree. And unfortunately, because of the way that the fisheries has dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, we witnessed what we saw in 1999 to a great degree, but albeit a different context in 2020. And yeah, my first degree, which was St. Mary's University, I didn't even have a clue what a dean was. And I didn't even know what a dean was, but because I had taken this small business counseling program that was supported by Native Council and folks, I was encouraged, well, geez, you should try a course or two at university. And I didn't even think, this was just as we were starting to take over our own education. At that point, when I went, we still had to call up Indian Affairs and all those kinds. There's all kinds of stories about that. But I remember meeting the dean and being so nervous, and he had this tie and shirt on, and his name, I want to say, is Jim Morrison, Mr. Morrison. He was the dean of the arts, and he taught oral history. I remember that because I took that course. And when I seen him stand up, he had jeans and he had these sneakers on. I said, oh, okay. So I kind of relaxed. But it was because of him, and he managed to help me get enough courses that I would qualify for funding from then the Department of Indian Affairs. And that started the whole journey. And I just was talking to Dr. Reed here not too long ago, as you will know, is witnessed during the Donald Marshall case, and for us. And he's quite a fascinating historian. And I remember sitting in his class, and he gave the Mi'kmaq so much agency. How, like we're talking about the whole English or the British and the French wars and so forth, but really how the Mi'kmaq had a lot of agency in that, how we negotiated, how we, strategize. And I wasn't used to that. Mm-hmm. I was used to the old elementary school where you learned that your people were savages. And I said, wait a minute. And so that was so empowering for me. And so from there on in, I just learned to read between the lines and try to figure out, but basically, or figure out how I could help my people. But basically, it was being brought up on the reserve, and it was in the mid to late 80s that I realized that we were not in control of our own destiny, that there was this bureaucracy, Indian Affairs. And I knew then that what was happening internally in my community was not just us as a people. All of our issues and so forth was being influenced elsewhere. And that's what motivated me really in the end to, I want to find out who are these people? Who are these people, or who are these departments that are controlling our community? And so I did my BA, and I did a Bachelor of Education and did a few things in between, and I did my master's when I was coordinating the certificate program in addictions for NADACA, for the Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counseling Association. And I think in the back of my head, I always thought, well, I'll do a PhD, but life has a funny way of taking over, because at the same time that Donald Marshall Jr. came in, I'm on council. I had this beautiful 1-year-old. She was 9 months old, and Destiny. And so I raised her, and as you well know, I got really sick in 2009, and that delayed things. And I just thought I needed a different type of stress. So I did my PhD to try to, reflect on all of the stuff that had happened. And I didn't really plan on being a professor, but here I am.
But fisheries seems to have grabbed hold of you, not just
Run away
regionally,
from it. Yes.
internationally. What are you
Yes.
doing how did you get to that place?
Oh, I love international work. I just told them I love working with my own people, but I love the international level. While I was chief, I ran across through my colleagues this organization called the World Forum of Fisher Peoples. And I cannot recall the preamble to their constitution at the time. And I thought, alls I knew, I wish I had it right here. Alls I knew is that I said, this is what Bear River is trying to do. Who are these people? And they're the poorest of the poor, an international organization born out of India. And so I had a lot of tragedy in 2004. I lost my younger brother, and the politics at that point had gotten to me and so forth. And then we were getting these invitations to go to this General Assembly, to this World Forum of Fisher People. So I talked to then Chief Frank Muse, who got back in again. And so I went to Kenya. And at the time, I was so frustrated because we were the few, we did, as non-signing communities into the fisheries, we didn't feel that we had any voice. Everything was going to move on. Chief Ridge Maloney did try to intervene at some point. Well, wait a minute. What about these communities? They shouldn't be penalized. But everybody was moving on, and I just felt that we didn't have a voice, even within our own organizations, or with definitely not with the federal government. It was tough. You guys didn't sign, so that was sort of the attitude. So when I traveled to Kenya, and I just lost my younger brother, who was a fisherman as well, and I got to Kenya that fall. We lost Joey in March, and I remember telling our story once, and they got it. These poor fishermen were from Sri Lanka, India, South Africa. They just got it, and that was it. They just sort of embraced, and it was a healing time for me, because at the time, at that particular General Assembly, they were honoring all the fishermen that had passed, and that was very healing for me because of my younger brother. And so they were very much at the time a people's movement. I think now they struggle. I haven't been a part of it since 2016. I sort of stay in contact, but not as much. But we're very much a people's movement. But what had happened was about 7 years of our life was getting these small scale fishery guidelines passed. And if you look at those guidelines, even though they're voluntary, they have gender, they have women, they have Indigenous, they have UNDRIP in them. And that was the main bulk of our work. And it seemed after that, people just started focusing on different things. And of course, I got sick through all that and had to have a different focus. So, but that was some of my international work. And I love it. I still love working with people internationally. I don't know what that is, and I don't speak any other language. I do a lot of sign language, but I just absolutely love it. I come to life, and that's just why I'm so excited to be going to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous People. So, because those are Indigenous folks from around the world as well. It's what was happening down in Saulnieville and so forth.
What was that?
Pardon me?
What was that?
That was the big uproar with Suspenagony trying to exercise their version of and the pushback that they received. And she reminded me here not too long ago that she was driving a car and talking to me about this. And she said she'll never forget it. She said, I was going on and talking about this, and I asked, who is speaking for the fish? And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately because the fish has been commodified as a thing. We speak about it as a, as a treaty right. We speak about having access and so forth. And I do know for some First Nations communities, fish is food, a very important part of our survival. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately because the grandmothers who were in the fight against Alton gas, or as they would say, defending their ancestral homelands, and the Willistic women, grandmothers who was fighting against Sis and Mine, they reminded me so much. They were so involved in ceremony and how a river has rights, and we've seen this finally happen in Quebec, and how somebody needs to be fighting for these species. And I'm starting to think, okay, if we can fight for a river to have personhood rights, well, who's going to fight for the fish? Like when you think about that. So that's just where my mind is at now, Kathy, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about that as, the tree being our relative. Oh, these are relatives, and we say they're our relatives, and we have this reciprocal understanding with those relatives. But we're worried about sustainability, future generations, and those type of reciprocal relationships. So who's going to fight for our relatives? And so maybe we should start talking about trees having personhood. Well, a lot of this has been proven, they talk to one another and so forth, and start moving in that direction.
So there are relatives and other things are our relatives. What do you mean?
Well, when we do forestry practice, do we really think about what we are doing? I know that the Mi'kmaq have this forestry initiative now in this part of Mi'kmaq we call Nova Scotia that seem to be trying to get back at some of those ancestral understandings. And so what I mean is that we have a relationship and a responsibility to all of life. And I'm not 100% certain that we dominate nature as much as we think we have, because I think climate change is the way that the earth and that our relatives are speaking back to us. And what I mean is those non-human relatives.
Okay, that's kind of like you're an Albert Marshall follower.
Yes. Yes.
We all are.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I know Carrie Prosper spoke to that once when I was talking with him, and I just went, yeah, right. They are our relatives. And you just said something that I remember. You you brought the fact that, we're responsible for all life. Is that a woman's thing? Is that a indigenous position?
Have, because I think climate change is the way that the earth and that our relatives are speaking back to us. And what I mean is those non-human relatives. I think that throughout time we understood this, and I think we still maintain, even with everything that has been done to us, even displaced Indigenous women who have been displaced or who are at risk of being missing and murdered, has this very strong conscious awareness of all of life and being related to all of life, even though it comes out of our control. And I think even more so, however, that's not to discredit our men, particularly those who are trying to learn through ceremony or learn their roles as well. And of course, we know grandmothers who teach us that. And I remember when I was telling you when earlier when I was chief, we did these study tours in British Columbia, and we were trying to find Indigenous and non-Indigenous management organizations or examples of that. And I cannot remember for the life of me this. I know some of my colleagues would know, but it was a tribal council that was working quite diligently with this non-Indigenous fishing organization, and they had formed this management board. And I was talking to one of the elders that was on that tribal council, and I asked him, and I said, don't you get any pushback from your own community? Why are you collaborating with these non-Indigenous people? Like, why are you doing that? Because I used to get some of that, right? And I remember him saying, he said, we are responsible for all of life in our traditional territories. And he said, and today that happens to include non-Indigenous people. And that has stayed with me. And so we have to kind of think that way. And so I think as women, we are more in tune to it, particularly and Kathy, I look at you as a mentor. Some of this I could blame on you and why I'm here, but but reestablishing our roles, and I remember one time you were saying just do it. We're just going to do it. And of course, we have some sisters in New Brunswick that would think that way. And then I think about some of the journeys, how we've intertwined, and some of the work that we're even doing with the chiefs now. I wish we had that when I was chief. And what I'm talking about is our ceremonies and the opportunity to speak from the heart, not just, from an agenda. And so I have hope, and that's my hope for the future. And of course, I'm in this role as district chief. I had no idea that my name was being put forward, and the mainland chiefs who belong to the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq had started this role as district chief. And I guess there was a gap there, and so a few names were put forward, and my name won out. And I didn't know it was being put forward, and so I didn't know how I felt about this. And I'm starting to really learn a lot, and I love the idea that I'm asked for advice from time to time or what my thoughts are. And it's sort of like being a consultant because you can kind of provide, because I don't have no voting rights, and you can kind of provide it, and it's up to them to take it or not. But at the end of the day, as long as, and every day I ask for guidance which, as you know, is a challenge for me of like, let the words I speak, let the words, my actions be for the betterment of our people and future generations. That's difficult. The old Sherry probably 20 years ago when I was chief to now, maybe I'm learning, I don't know. So that's how I came into that role, and it was the first female because there was a couple, there was Chief John Knockwood, and I think they had a male district chief before him. So it's sort of like witnessing a bit as well. And so I'm growing into the role, and I love the work, and I do see a lot of overlap with my academic work that I'm trying to get off the ground right now. We're getting a sense of sort of what they need. And I love the idea of being able to connect the academic community in a way that serves the needs of our own people as opposed to being oppressing them. That's my hope anyways. And even better, restore the balance. Why do I think that's so important? I am scared that if we do not do it, that the terrible statistics, and some project even higher, that we've witnessed through, and of course you would know this through your work with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, will increase tenfold. And we have a unique opportunity at this point in time, particularly with that, in those calls to action that came out of the inquiry. There's something seriously, seriously wrong when our women go missing or at risk of violence to the degree that they are. And there's many social reasons for that. I understand that. I think, though, Kathy, through the guidance of some very special women who's been through some tough times, including yourself, and mentoring other women and so forth, we come from a strengths-based position and not that victims-based. And we need that more so than ever. Not that we haven't been oppressed and not that we haven't been victims, but that shouldn't be our legacy. We have so much to offer. And why is that so important in this point in time is because we have an opportunity to transform those patriarchal and colonial, or those patriarchal colonial structures that have been imposed on our communities, that has caused this havoc. And this is the opportune time to restore that. And it's not going to happen overnight. But and as some of our friends would say, it's going to take the healing of both women and men. But we definitely have to restore our women's roles, their wisdom, what they have to offer. And in such an ironic way, despite everything that's been done to them in terms of dispossession from their communities along patrilineal lines, if they married out and all of this stuff, everything that they've done to them, they seem to hold dear onto our ceremonies and that way of life. And I don't know if it's because they never benefited from those patriarchal colonial structures, but they seem to be the first ones out to protect the waters and lands from further damage. Mm-hmm. And so there's something inherent in our knowledge and our wisdom, despite all that we've been through, that I think that will help heal our communities. I'm learning a lot from my peers, and that deeply touches my heart. And sometimes, when your heart's touching it, there's a reason behind that. And I think I need to continue to follow that because I've so reluctantly, and there's a reason behind all of that. And I'm not saying I'm no more important than my sister is and so forth, but there's something happening in that universe, and I think it's so important. And I'm trying not to lose sight of that. What's this all about? The other side of me has always been to read between the lines. And a university has done this, and university education has done this for me. What you necessarily read it's, it comes from a very Eurocentric patriarchal point of view. Why were not more women mentioned and so forth? And as we're learning through oral history and the stories that we're hearing, whoa, women had a very powerful role or powerful roles. And so when, like, I am a little bit of a history buff. When you start doing research or you start hearing the stories, you have to kind of almost read and hear between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm having this sense of doing some work with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Well, I should say the Mi'kmaq Way DeBert Center, and I think they're doing some fantastic work. And we have some fabulous elders like the late elder Dr. Merdina Marshall, Lillian Marshall, and those folks. And let's go back and hear their stories, and like the teachings that you pass on from Sarah Denny, and so forth. There's something in that. And when I've read some historical excerpts, I'm thinking, well, why would that woman refuse to get in? Like, there's a story, I think around 1920s, where this Mi'kmaq woman was supposed to get married, and she refused to take the husband's surname because she didn't want to get into she said white ways, but non-Indigenous ways. Well, what was that all about? What was that all about? What does that tell us about our naming system and so forth? And these are the things that intrigue me, or and the ceremonies that we've used to do, or hunters making an offering at a rock and offering it to the grandmothers. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's all there. It's a matter of us relearning that, and then how do you apply that in this modern day context? When you were asking me about my role as chief, and I was telling you how in my own community, I didn't see gender as an issue, but I had so much respect, and still do in so many ways, and thinking, yeah, well, there's respect there for certain women leaders where they follow, they look to you for guidance. And I remember, just finish with this, and you can edit this out or not, but I remember my grandmother, when I was quite young, when she was chief, she may have been council, 'cause she was council for a few years too. And I remember her getting up early in the morning and going on these trucks to go and get supplies when we were trying to build our own houses and so forth. And the guys wouldn't go to well, first of all, she was a chief probably because she had a say, or but they wouldn't go without her. They would take her right to the store, like to get the lumber and so forth. And I asked her about that one time, and she said, we have to encourage our men that they're capable of building these houses, that they can do that, because up to that point, we didn't have jobs, people would come in and so forth. It's like, so going back in the 70s. And she said, and who best knows how a house should be built than the women? And so here she was training these carpenters and so forth, and she was just trying to motivate them, to empower them. And I thought that was so interesting. And I said, yeah, she's right. Who knows? Who knows how a house should be built? So that stayed within my mind. It was a weird intersection of this, what was then a predominantly male industry and building, but then to have it even Indigenous people to build houses, and hear this woman leader telling them how to do it,
Yeah.
because colonialism hit our populations differently, or segments of our population differently. It's not, and that's a great analysis in terms of only certain men could hold power, and the rest of the men, when I think back in the poverty that we were raised in, it's extraordinary too. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that you're at Dalhousie University having this conversation?
Then
three brothers. From 2004, I lost the baby brother. 2007, lost the oldest brother. In 2018, Mike, he was the IT person for the community. We lost him. A lot of losses. Sometimes, I tell my children, as you know, I have a son in Eskasoni who I'm very proud of, Justin, and his family. And I was talking to him not too long ago, and I said, I wasn't a very hands-on mom. I really wasn't. But you have to do these things and wear these multiple hats and so forth. And yeah, and it's funny. The grief, as you well know, grief of loss of loved ones, hits me every day in some way. However, I'm think what's so exciting about this point in my life is that I'm coming to terms with it.
Yeah.
In a very good way. I'm starting to, I don't know what has happened, but healing is possible. And, I just feel their spirit with me all the time. I had a lot of prayers at that point too, a lot of prayers through India around the world because of the World Forum of Fisher People. I don't know. It was a weird time, and there was two things that happened to me during that time. I had third stage lymphoma, Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I just buried my older brother to fourth stage lung cancer, and my uncle a year later. They were the best friends. And so it was very difficult for the community to comprehend the big C and that I was probably going to die too. And somehow I internalized some of that. And it was my son. It was my son on the phone that basically told me in no certain words, because his little sister was just little at the time, saying, "You have to fight. You have your daughter to raise." And I remember that. And I guess my younger brother, ironically, that passed away, had told me something like that during another hard time. The other thing too is through ceremony, and people can take this the way this is to a ceremony. My mother spoke to me, and she's been gone a long, long time, and she told me I was going to be okay. And I thought I had imagined it, because it was sort of like, and I thought I'd imagined. About 3 days later, I found out I was in complete remission. So I don't know those. I can reflect on them now, and I don't know what's around the corner, but I just know, based on what's going on in the world, Ukraine, other areas of the world, my heavens, I have to be thankful every day, for every single day. You don't know when it's going to be your last day. I remember you telling me one time, actually, it was at another difficult time. It was 2017. Didn't know if to apply for that job at the Mount or what was going on. And you said, "Sherry, you got to find out. The Creator must have some purpose for you. You survived that cancer. And so, yeah. So we'll see." I would say, I would have to reflect back to when I was chief. And I can only imagine the turmoil that's put on chiefs, whether they're elected or how they are leaders. And I imagine for any leader, any health director, any education director, and so forth, is, you have so much worry for your people, and we know what our people need. We just talked about it, about healing and ceremony and so forth, and restoring our roles. And some of us, I guess, in a roundabout way, that's been our life journey. When you're chief and you have to deal with agreements, when you have to deal with bureaucracies, it is so difficult because it's a one blanket that fits all. It goes by per capita, and as you know, every community is unique, and you're there torn, and you're up through the nights trying to figure out how can you jump through the loopholes to make things work for your people. And that had to been the most difficult time, particularly when you're dealing with bureaucracies and they're not letting you do what you need to do. And I've seen life lost over that because of bureaucracies couldn't, you know, they had no problem telling us what to do, but if you needed, okay, we're going to follow your policies, they wouldn't be willing to stand by those policies. And, you know, and I'm talking about a housing crisis that I was involved with, that I watched a family and I watched a person die. I that's probably my biggest regret. As hard as I tried to bring all the agencies, the health department, children, family sort of stuff, why did that incident happen? And I felt so helpless as a chief. And so there's that side of the coin. And I would say that was the biggest challenge. There's probably many others that I can think of, you know, and I think now trying to come to terms, like I like to think that we're reasonably still young, but I'm starting to feel the ageism a little bit too. But I'm just trying to embrace it, and I'm going to use my elder's card now a little bit more and just give my 2 cents worth. But I'm starting to see a change. It's slow, but it's starting to be there. Whoa. And yeah, I, I don't know. Did you know that you were going to be where you are? This is ironic because it's not in a Mi'kmaq context. I'd have to go back to that trip to Kenya, and I'd been through a really rough time. I don't know where I received my strength during that time. Why I didn't give up at that point, I don't know. And I think a lot of it was losing my baby brother. Like, I have 2 older brothers. We met later in life, but I was raised with my baby brother, and it's, oh my heavens, I didn't think I was ever going to rebound from that. And I remember that moment standing somewhere in Kenya, when I couldn't stop crying. The tears, when it wasn't like a loud cry, it was just tears because it was so much was draining out of me at that moment. And I had this aha moment, and it only happens in a minute. And this is what I'm learning what happiness is about. It's not like, oh, if I do this, then I'll be happy. If I do that, it's not. It happens in seconds. And we have to be awake because otherwise we miss them. And I'll never forget that moment saying, you know, Sherry, and it happened faster in my head than what I'm telling you. Whatever you've been through, whatever you've done, whatever hurt you felt or who's hurt you feel that's hurt you, it doesn't matter. It all led to this moment here and now. And that was in November of 2004. And I've had very far and few, but that was one of those particular moments. Well, I see with the work that we're doing, even as an Indigenous woman, some of our ceremonies coming back and our teachings coming back, and it's not just superficial.
Yeah.
It's really informing and empowering us as a people. It's taken a little while to get there, but also that's coming back, as you well know, is our concepts of law, our concepts of family, our concepts of way of being. And what I would love to see is that move to the point where, as I tell the chiefs all the time, decide what you want for your communities. Let's envision what we need for our communities, and let's tell the world these are the type of investments that we will receive. Don't come to us if it's about, you know, certain things. It's so hard, but unsustainable practices. We want only sustainability. We want to be able to have a truly Mi'kmaq governance where it's beyond just the chief and council. It's beyond the relationship that we have with the federal federal government. It's like how we operate as a people to give other people voice, to give other people say in the consensus making. And so, to sum it up, is just to have a truly Mi'kmaq, and I don't even like using the word governance, because as we know from our linguist, Bernie Francis, there's no word. There's several other words and principles that relate to the English concept of governance, if you will, or in the English language. But to bring those back, or one of the extraordinary things, I don't quite understand it, but Lillian Marshall talking about their gathering every year, and they haven't had to have it, the St. Maui gathering.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a worn down circle there. It's still there somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's a whole forgiveness ceremony. And someone was saying you weren't allowed to, through her teachings, you weren't allowed to stay angry more than 6 months. Now, I'm trying to picture this. What kind of dance, what kind of ceremony where we would learn to forgive one another? Isn't that incredible? And I just find that fascinating. Those are the type of principles that I think will help our nation. We're slowly, like, I remember the days when we still called ourselves Mi'kmaq. Yeah, Indian. Yeah. I'm too tired. Let the younger generation take over. If they need my help, I'll support them, but I'm too tired.
Yeah.
I think I'll do this stint at Dal, see where it takes me, because, I just feel that I'm still spinning my wheels, but maybe this is a good thing, because if I had not received that position or gotten to that position as district chief, I don't think I'd be, I have some ideas of how I'm going to go about that. And I think there's some support of the chiefs, and I'll talk to you about that sometime, and that work that needs to be done. And then we'll see. I'm a little tired. I don't have a whole lot of, as you know, I've been an activist, and so I don't have a big pension plan or anything. My gosh, it would be just nice, to just hang out, plant medicines. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, but my family said, yeah, and how long would that last? I should be reading more books, but I think COVID world has me so exhausted at the end of the day. I don't write as much as I want to. I'm going to have to force myself to write here over the summer, which I swore I'd never do again. I don't write as much as I would love to, but it's only because 2 or 3 meetings in front of the computer, who wants to sit there for another few hours to write? It's the same thing. You're not interacting, but you're still trying to, in a headspace. So I have this terrible habit of just Netflixing out. Okay. Good night,
Yeah.
Kathy. Thanks so
All right.
much. I don't know what you're going to get out of that. I leave it all up to you, my dear, to take what you wish out of that.
Well, Meg and Candace Paul and Andrea Paul are the other panelists.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, I'm going to miss Migs. Please give her all of my love. I just love her. I want to do another workshop with her, and her to do that teaching with us again about the 8-pointed star and that. I just love her. Yeah, she's just, oh,